Hello, my name is Christy Howell, Deputy Division Chief in the IMF Statistics Department. I'd like to welcome you to this preview of the IMF online course, External Debt Statistics, or EDSx. The EDSx course focuses on providing a better understanding of external debt statistics for compilers and users. It introduces the fundamentals underlying external debt statistics and how they reflect your economy's indebtedness vis-à-vis the rest of the world. Markets and policymakers need better external debt statistics to help assess external vulnerabilities at a time when increasing international capital flows are resulting in greater market interdependence. This online course will walk you through the core concepts and definitions relevant to external debt statistics. We'll discuss the main characteristics of debt instruments and how they differ from other financial instruments. You'll learn how to present external debt statistics according to international standards, including the Balance of Payments and International Investment Position Manual, 6th edition. You'll understand the classification of different types of debt reorganization and the changes in external debt position arising from debt reorganization. We'll explain the main features of contingent liabilities, and you'll get introduced to the main elements of the external debt sustainability analysis framework, as well as factors that affect an economy's debt sustainability. The EDSx course is based on the statistical framework for external debt presented in the External Debt Statistics Guide for Compilers and Users. If you're an external sector statistics compiler or a data user, there's a lot of information for you in this course. Register for the full EDSx course for free at the link below, imf.org/learning. I hope you decide to join us. The external debt comprises four cornerstone characteristics that constitute its essence, which are residence, outstanding and actual current liabilities, current and not contingent liabilities, and payment of principal and/or interest. To qualify as external debt, the debt liabilities must be owed by a resident to a non-resident. Residence is not determined by the nationality, but by where the debtor and the creditor have their center of predominant economic interest, or typically where they are ordinarily located. External debt includes outstanding and actual current liabilities. For a liability to be included in external debt, it must exist and be outstanding. This is exemplified by whether a creditor owns a claim on the debtor, or in other words, a debtor has a liability to a creditor. A debt liability is typically established through the provision by the creditor of an economic value to the debtor. The economic value could be in the form of a financial asset, good, service, or income. For instance, Company A, resident of Country A, sold construction equipment to Company B, resident of Country B. The equipment was delivered in period T. Company B will pay for the equipment in the period T+1. Consequently, because the payment for the equipment is not made in period T, an existing debt liability of Company B to Company A is established in that period in the amount of the value of the equipment. This debt liability should be accounted for in the external debt of Country B. In the same period T, Company B received a loan from Bank C, resident of Country A. As a result, Company B incurs another existing debt liability in the form of a loan. Consequently, this debt liability is also included in Country B's external debt. For a liability to be included in external debt, it should be current and not contingent. Contingent liabilities are not included in the definition of external debt. Contingent liabilities are defined as arrangements where one or more conditions must be fulfilled before a financial transaction takes place. Such liabilities may involve a legal contract, specifying that one party is obliged to provide a payment or series of payments to another unit only if certain specified conditions prevail. Let's assume that in the previous example, Bank C only committed in period T to provide the loan to Company B, but the loan will be disbursed in period T+1. Consequently, in period T, no liability would be included in Country B's external debt because the commitment does not result in an existing liability until the funds are actually disbursed by Bank C. The liability included in external debt requires payment of principal and/or interest. The amount the debtor owes to the creditor is known as the principal amount. The provision of economic value by the creditor or the creation of debt liabilities through other means may require payment for the use of this economic value. This is known as interest cost for the debtor. When this cost is paid, it is known as an interest payment. All other payments by the debtor to the creditor that reduce the principal outstanding amount are known as principal payments. The definition of external debt does not distinguish whether it is required to repay principal or interest or both. For instance, interest-free loans are debt instruments, although they require only the repayment of principal and no interest is paid. Further, perpetual bonds are debt instruments, although they require only the payment of interest and no principal is to be repaid.
The attribution of debt liabilities to institutional sectors in many cases is straightforward, as there is only one resident, the debtor, involved in the transaction. However, in some cases, the institutional sector of the resident debtor may not coincide with the institutional sector of the resident transactor. This is applicable to debt securities when the issuer, which is the debtor, may be a resident in one institutional sector, the seller of the debt security, which is the transactor, may be a resident in another institutional sector, and the buyer, which is the creditor, is a non-resident. For example, suppose that a non-financial corporation resident of Country A issues a debt security that is purchased by Bank A, also resident of Country A. Bank A then sells the debt security to a bank resident of Country B. In this case, from the point of view of Country A, the resident debtor is the non-financial corporation, which belongs to other sectors. However, the resident bank that is selling the debt security to a non-resident, that is the transactor, belongs to the deposit-taking corporations except the central bank sector. Consequently, when the sector of the resident debtor does not coincide with the sector of the resident that owns the asset, who is the transactor, there are two possibilities for the attribution of the institutional sector: the institutional sector of the debtor or the institutional sector of the transactor, the owner of the asset. In external debt statistics, for the attribution of debt liabilities to institutional sectors, the sector of the debtor is the one that determines the classification by institutional sector. This is because the obligation to extinguish the debt liability at the maturity of the debt security remains with the issuer and not with the transactor. Therefore, in this example, the debt security liability should be attributed to other sectors. Let's look at another example and assume that Company A, resident of Country A, contracted a loan from a non-resident Bank B. The loan was guaranteed by the government of Country A. In this case, the attribution of the loan liability by institutional sector is done according to the sector of Company A, which is other sectors, and not of the guarantor. However, if Company A fails to repay the loan according to the payment schedule, and the guarantee is activated, the external loan liability will then be reclassified to the sector of the guarantor, which is general government. Financial assets and liabilities are classified by financial instrument. In external sector statistics, there are three broad categories of financial instruments: debt instruments, equity and investment fund shares, and other financial assets and liabilities. The first category, debt instruments, constitutes the core components of external debt statistics. Debt instruments are those that require the payment of principal and/or interest at some point in the future. This includes debt securities, currency and deposits, loans, insurance, pension, and standardized guarantee schemes, trade credits and advances, other accounts receivable payable, and special drawing rights. The other two categories, equity and investment fund shares, and other financial assets and liabilities, are non-debt financial instruments and therefore are not included in the external debt position. Equity and investment fund shares consist of all instruments and records that acknowledge claims on the residual value of a corporation or quasi-corporation. In contrast to debt instruments, equity and investment fund shares do not entitle the holders of shares to a fixed or predetermined income. Their return is largely dependent on the economic performance of the corporation. Other financial assets and liabilities include monetary gold in the form of bullion and financial derivatives and employee stock options, or ESOs. Monetary gold in the form of gold bullion is the only financial asset that does not have a counterpart liability. Therefore, it is not a debt instrument. As for financial derivatives and ESOs, they are designed as a risk transfer instrument. For them, no advanced principal amount is required to be repaid. In addition, no interest accrues on any financial derivative instrument. There are three possibilities with regard to the accrual of interest in a reporting period. First, interest has accrued and is paid when due within the recording period. Second, interest has accrued and is not paid when due within the reporting period. In this case, interest is in arrears at the end of the reporting period because it was not paid when due. Third, interest is accrued but not paid during the reporting period because it is not yet due for payment. Under the accrual basis of recording, the accrued interest not yet paid is part of the outstanding amount of the financial instrument. For example, interest is paid every 6 months, but the reporting period is quarterly. Therefore, at the end of the first quarter, interest is accrued for 3 months, but is not yet due for payment. In the second and third cases, the accrued interest should be included as part of the value of the underlying debt instruments. In other words, the accrual of interest continuously increases the amount outstanding of the debt instrument until the interest is paid. In macroeconomic statistics, the interest is calculated following the debtor approach. According to this approach, interest is equal to the amounts the debtor will have to pay to the creditor above the repayment of the amounts advanced by the creditor. For fixed-rate debt instruments, this approach assumes that interest cost is determined at inception for the entire life of a financial instrument. For variable-rate debt instruments, the accrued interest is linked to a reference index, such as the SOFR, Secured Overnight Financing Rate.
The first level of disaggregation of the gross external debt position under the public sector-based approach is by sector. Primarily, this disaggregation is between public and publicly guaranteed debt and private sector external debt not publicly guaranteed. Because of the nature of the relationship between the debtor and creditor, intercompany lending between entities in a direct investment relationship is separately identified under each sector. Publicly guaranteed private sector external debt is the external debt liabilities of the private sector that are contractually guaranteed by a public unit resident in the same economy as the debtor. External debt of the private sector that is not contractually guaranteed by a public sector unit resident in the same economy is classified as private sector external debt not publicly guaranteed. In some cases, the government guarantees only the repayment of part of an external debt liability of the private debtor. For example, when only the repayment of principal is guaranteed, only the present value of the principal payments should be included within publicly guaranteed private sector external debt. The non-guaranteed part, which is payments of interest, should be included in private sector external debt not publicly guaranteed. The second level of disaggregation of the gross external debt position is by the maturity of external debt, short-term and long-term, on the basis of original maturity. The maturity attribution is not provided for intercompany lending. The third level of disaggregation is by the type of debt instrument. However, not all debt instruments are separately identified. Similar to the institutional sector-based approach, insurance, pension, and standardized guarantee schemes, and other accounts payable are included under other debt liabilities. Similar to the institutional sector-based approach, this table includes memorandum items covering two components: the total value of arrears and the total value of debt securities by public and private sectors. The data on arrears of the public sector may be of specific interest for users as they show the extent to which the government has difficulties in meeting its external obligations.
Debt forgiveness reduces the gross external debt position by the value of the outstanding principal that has been forgiven. Any reduction in the principal is recorded under the appropriate debt instrument when it is received. That is also when both the debtor and creditor record the forgiveness in their books. When debt obligations that are past due, for instance, arrears of interest and principal, are forgiven, a reduction in the gross external debt position under the appropriate debt instrument is recorded. Let's assume that at the beginning of year 1, the government of country A has outstanding external loan liabilities to the government of country B in the amount of $10,000. The outstanding amount consists of outstanding principal of $8,500, of which $1,000 is principal in arrears, $300 is interest in arrears, and $200 is accrued interest not yet due. During year 1, country A continued facing difficulties in meeting its external debt obligations, and the debtor, the government of country A, negotiated debt relief with the creditor, the government of country B. The creditor provided forgiveness of the following debt liabilities: arrears in principal, $1,000, principal due for payment in year 1, $400, and arrears in interest, $300. Assuming that the government of country A has not disbursed new loans during year 1, the outstanding loan liabilities of country A at the end of year 1 equals $8,300, which is the outstanding amount at the beginning of the year, $10,000, minus $1,700, the total amount forgiven, which consists of $1,000 of forgiven arrears in principal, $400 of forgiven principal due for payment in year 1, and $300 of forgiven interest in arrears. Consequently, the debt reduction for country A in year 1 is equal to $1,700.
Debt is a natural consequence of an economic activity. At any time, some economic entities have income more than their current consumption and investment requirements, while other entities are in deficit. Through the creation of debt, both entities can realize their consumption and investment preferences, and as a result, encourage economic growth. The growing economies often use foreign financial resources to finance domestic investment. However, access to foreign finance could also lead to accumulation of unsustainable external debt, which is costly to a country and can disrupt the smooth functioning of international capital markets. Therefore, from the country perspective, there's a need for sound risk management procedures, and from sustainability perspective, there's a need for the maintenance of external debt. Debt is created on the assumption that the debtor country will meet the requirements of the debt contracts. However, in some cases, the debtor country's resources can be insufficient for serving the debt liabilities. The objective of external debt sustainability analysis, or DSA, is to evaluate a country's capacity to finance its macroeconomic objectives and service the subsequent debt. It aims to help policymakers identify imbalances as they are building up. DSAs are an integral part of the IMF's assessment of member countries' policies in the context of program monitoring and country surveillance. To this end, the IMF has developed two frameworks for conducting external DSA. One framework is focusing on low-income countries, and the other is focusing on market access countries. The second includes both advanced and emerging market economies. In the next unit, we will look at the main concepts associated with external debt sustainability and the basic steps involved in the preparation of external DSA.